This is Jay Scott.
This is Trent Lackey. Welcome.
You're listening to World of the Unexplained. Tonight we have with us the Bishop Sean Manchester of the Highgate Vampire fame. He's going to talk about what went on in Highgate in the 1970s. Hello, welcome to World of the Unexplained. Bishop Manchester, how are you today?
Very well. Greetings from England. I very much hope we'll be talking about more than the occurrences 4 decades ago.
Certainly.
In an obscure suburb of what would have been London.
Oh, yes.
Another time.
Well, hopefully so. Well, let's begin at the beginning. First of all, a little bit about yourself early on, and what inspired you to go and pursue this course that you're on now.
Well, I have to presume that you're referring to a particular ministry of which is only one strand of what I do.
Certainly.
And if you are referring to that, the ministry of exorcism, it's part and parcel of the journey and the path of a priest. By definition, a priest should be an exorcist. It's required. Mark 16, verse 17, teaches that believers will cast out demons in his name. And the particular extraordinary, some might say, course that I have followed and that has unraveled before me is not extraordinary to those in my field, but to those who are not chosen for this particular work. And I do feel it's something you're chosen to do rather than choose to do. It must appear quite beyond belief. Within demonology, I suppose the subgroup for which I'm particularly best known, which trespasses upon the mysteries of life and death itself, is curious in this way that whilst many in today's material world couldn't possibly deny that there are unseen forces, influences, if you will, at work, about which we know very little and over which we exert even less control, and are willing to entertain the ideas of ghosts, poltergeists, malignant spirits, all manner of paranormal phenomena, including extraterrestrial abductions and what have you. They stop short of that V word, and when the V word is mentioned, suddenly it evokes extreme cynicism, skepticism, and sometimes even hostility. It's as though we can discuss anything but not that seriously.
Yeah,
and yet,
I noticed that.
In my experience, there is more evidence for that than there are for many other things.
Oh, certainly.
Now, you've got pictures posted on your site that Gothic Press maintains. With one of the photos, I believe, is of the actual staking of this Highgate creature right before its I guess disappearance, right before it disintegrated in front of your very eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other pictures on there too. We're gonna put a link up on our site for the viewers to or the listeners to to go and see those. But tell us, how did all this start?
Yeah.
How did my interest start in the subject matter?
No, how did?
I mean, I studied I suppose the arcane, the realm of the hidden world, the unseen world, the occult, quite a way back when I was still a teenager. Read the books of Montague Summers and many others on this subject in particular.
And he's a great writer. Yeah. I've got a few of those books on my shelf as well. So
yeah,
fantastic reading.
Oh yes.
Yes, and particularly the detail. But I didn't for a moment think at that time that I would be confronting at such an early age in something that Montague Summers had written about. And when I did, even way back then, it caused all sorts of panic and fear and disbelief, and on a scale which one might anticipate if an alien had landed from outer space. And I think that's, as T.S. Eliot said in one of his poems, that humankind simply can't bear very much reality. And certainly the collective imagination had no defense against what we unearthed back then in the late 60s in Highgate. It's too much reality, and people prefer a much safer, I suppose, illusion to the supernatural reality that exists all the time around us. But it's very difficult to dismiss something that real by ignoring it. And of course its strength, the strength of all supernatural phenomena, exists in the fact that so few subscribe to its reality. But back then, things were happening. I think things had been happening for a long time. I mean, we found eventually records going back to pre-Victorian times. But I believe there were strange happenings going back further than that. It had a strange history, did Highgate, which almost reaches back to the medieval period. However, there is no evidence of vampire infestation going back that far.
Okay.
But certainly, even before I was cognizant of a vampire contagion in Highgate, people were already aware of this. There was somebody in July 1965, for example, who apparently came face to face with something which he described as powerful and malignant, something radiating evil. The best way he could describe it. It wasn't a ghost, he said. This was an entity. Nothing remotely human about it. It wasn't human, in fact. And he tried to pronounce a Latin incantation to repel evil. Quite how he knew that, I don't know, but that's what he attempted. But he could do nothing of the kind. He couldn't move. His limbs felt like lead. And he described this entity that was very swift and had eyes which were like red coals burning. Now, I never spoke to that particular witness back in 1965. It's simply one of an absolute multitude of accounts that have appeared over the years. My first introduction to this phenomenon was in the region of the late 60s, when incidents occurred within weeks of one another in the early months of that year, which were to bring the phenomenon to my notice. At the time, I didn't pay any particular attention to them, but I couldn't help my interest being aroused nonetheless by their strange nature. And the first that came to my attention was when two 16-year-old pupils of a Catholic convent quite near Highgate were walking home at night after having visited friends in the village. Their journey took them down Swains Lane, past the overgrown cemetery. And two girls, Barbara and Elizabeth, were not inclined to believe what they saw as they passed the graveyard's north gate. And it was later that some time later, that I was able to talk to one of the girls, the other one not wanting really, although she confirmed seeing the same vision or phenomena or whatever, she didn't want to become involved. I think she was rather too frightened, though she was willing to privately confirm that she'd seen the same thing. But the other girl, Elizabeth, was able to give me her account, and we have actually the benefit of hearing her account from her own lips, as well as her written and account, which she was kind enough to record for us. I mean, if you would like, I could let you hear very briefly, in her own words, from that period, the late 60s, of exactly what happened.
That'd be great.
You'd like that?
Yeah,
it's very brief. We'll keep it that way, and it's followed by her boyfriend, Keith, who his voice follows on to record what he discovered happening at the very same time, bearing in mind that this is from the late 1960s. But I'll play it to you now, if I may.
Oh, yes, please.
Please.
Well, normally going past the cemetery when you're just in a normal mood, not anything outstanding, you do get a kind of you can feel an evil presence from the old cemetery. Yeah, when you're just normally. But this time we were coming down from Highgate Village. We were in a really great mood. We'd been to see some friends.
You were coming down Swains Lane?
We were coming down Swains Lane from Highgate Village. And we were all happy, but we weren't talking, we were just walking. And
How many of you were?
there was just two of us.
Yourself?
Myself and a girlfriend. And we're walking down, and we established that this was the time we both saw, where there's a graveyard in front of you, and the graves were opening up, and people were rising. I don't know, that night there was a strange sort of feeling. When we went to bed, I kept having dreams, and I couldn't remember them when I woke up, but I knew they weren't particularly nice, and they weren't just nightmares, they weren't nightmares of horror, just ordinary horror. And then one day I woke up, I went downstairs, there was two lumps on my neck. They weren't lumps, they were like pinholes.
On Wednesday, after this confrontation, she ran out into the night. I followed and eventually found her outside the gate of the cemetery at the top of Swains Lane. And in the look she gave me, I knew it had taken her. She was back in the trance again. Back at the flat, I slept on the couch in the room adjoining her bedroom. At about 1 a.m., I was woken by a stifled cry coming from the direction of Elizabeth's room. I jumped to my feet and found her gasping for breath, as if she had been almost suffocated. There were specks of blood on her pillow. I comforted her as best I could and remained there in her room till the daylight hours.
And they are the recordings of that very first witness that I at least came across, and her boyfriend, who proved very helpful in the event to making her the nightly visitations that she was experiencing not prove fatal.
Now, these tapes are available on your website as well. Is that correct?
Well, they are, yes. I mean, the various tapes are available using archive material where permission has been given.
Okay.
And that's one of the frustrations, because as with, the Highgate case is the most notorious, and we learned many lessons from it, but because it was so public, it was impossible to keep the lid on it. And in fact, it proved useful in the early days to turn the publicity to our advantage by having so many people make contact who had witness testimony to offer. And some of that testimony proved absolutely vital in the pursuit and final eradication of this malignant evil. However, it also poses problems, because in the early days, I enjoyed excellent relations with the various authorities who cooperated magnificently. But obviously, as it became a worldwide phenomenon, and it was being reported by Reuters and goodness knows who else, and it was on television, the good relations somewhat evaporated rather quickly, which was sad. But as I said, we learned lessons from that period long ago, and we applied them to future cases where we were altogether more careful in keeping it out of the public eye, and of course, as much as possible, even with the Highgate case, protecting people's identity and protecting any intelligence that came our way regarding sources that had asked us to respect and not compromise the confidentiality. I mean, a lot of people are uneasy as it is discussing anything supernatural, however benign. But to be discussing, particularly with somebody who, after the Highgate case, became known as a vampirologist, these matters places them at all sorts of, I suppose, vulnerable, puts them in a vulnerable position. Not just ridicule, but there are those who take an exception to those like myself who believe in casting out evil. I mean, sadly, there has been in the world, in my lifetime, an intensity never before witnessed of, I suppose, the rise in satanic cults and luciferic demonry, which assails mankind anyway. And with the rise of such cults and covens and groups and organizations, there has been a sort of tacit support for supernatural evil, such as the vampire might represent. I mean, if we look at, I don't really like naming organizations, but as they are quite overt, and of course the more dangerous ones are not, they're underground.
Of course,
and we wouldn't know their names, or probably wouldn't have a clue who they are. But even the more theatrical groups, like the Temple of Set, and I think even the Church of Satan, from which the Temple of Set broke away, have their Temple of the Vampire, Order of the Vampire. And of course, the satanic is wrapped up, bound, and absorbed in the vampiric. And it's not surprising that some form of transcendental evil, which has come to represent the very antithesis of certainly Christianity and anything that represents the triumph of good over evil, by this, I suppose, perversion of an afterlife, or what would appear to be at least an afterlife, and a perversion of a redeeming blood with this contaminating foul blood. I mean, blood plays a very, very important part in a lot of occult ritual, but in the satanic rituals it is central, in the way that it's central in the Christian Mass and Eucharist. The redeeming blood is all important. It is in fact the new covenant, likewise in Satanism, which frequently embraces vampirism, the use of blood as a base for elementals to manifest, to materialize, is also used. And there is a correlation between this almost Antichrist figure that the vampire represents, by its, I suppose, a complete turning upside down, the resurrection to come, and the gift of life ever after, which is turned into this filthy parody we call the undead.
Oh. Now, tell us about what happened as far as you tracking down the Highgate vampire and destroying it.
As far as I'm concerned, it began for me in the late 60s with people like Elizabeth contacting me. I mean, there were others, and pursuing the matter to its logical conclusion. I had the good fortune at that time to have colleagues who were more trained and seasoned than even I, who were that much older. People like Peter Underwood, who's a renowned author of the paranormal, and he was aware, very much so, that these things existed, and he too wrote of occurrences in Highgate Cemetery in the 1960s. Indeed, it was with him that the early part of the story was first published in his own anthology, The Vampire's Bedside Companion, 10 years before the first edition of my own account, unexpurgated account, that is, the Highgate vampire. But after the two convent schoolgirls, I spoke to a chap called, I won't give his name, but he spoke of a dark shape which moved across the path directly in front of him. On an earlier occasion, he had started to walk home with his fiancée down the lane, running alongside the cemetery, and they saw something standing behind the iron railings of the gate. Upon its face was an expression of basilisk horror. And again, the thing that was behind the gate appeared to dissolve into the shadows of the night. And that was a common description. But what pointed it in the direction of something more than a hideous spectre was this these other experiences. I mean, there was this girl I spoke to later, a teenager in North Hill. Her name is Jacqueline. Her brother vouched also for these experiences. I think he was slightly younger. And she awoke one night with something icy cold clutching her hand, and her hand soon went numb. The next morning revealed deep tears in the flesh where she had forced her hand free. Now I'm taking that directly from her account, and she and her brother also had this fascination, as they described it, which drew them to the nearby Highgate Cemetery, the western side, the infected side, as it would prove to be. And it was only when we discovered the pulsating heart, if you will, of that haunted place, that we were able to begin to get an idea of what we were truly dealing with. Although prior to that, the traditional antidotes and repellents, as with Elizabeth, had appeared at least to work. The use of those things which are regarded as effective in repelling evil spirits, vampires amongst them. I mean, the Catholic Encyclopedia itself states quite unequivocally that the Church doesn't deny that, with special permission of God, of course, the souls of the departed may appear to the living and even manifest things unknown to the latter. But we're not talking here of souls of the departed. We're talking of something from another region, something demonic, something which manifests as though it was the dead person. But it's something altogether more evil, masquerading, and what is the part that is beyond belief, the part that defies the imagination, is that there appears to be this ability to animate the corporeal form and almost give it sustenance. I mean, these entities represent a force which is really, any attempt to express it is almost impossible, because you're expressing the unknown and the unknowable, which invites scoffing, cynicism and disbelief. But such skepticism fails, nevertheless, to ensure the departure of these creatures.
So you're saying that these creatures, they're not the person that died reanimated. It's their body, their own corporal body reanimated, but it's reanimated by some sort of demon.
The agency is demonic. There's no question. There are various points of view, and there has been for centuries. I mean, even the James, King James, who obviously wrote his work on demonology in Latin, of course, and was himself something of a witch finder. He believed it was entirely a demonic agency at work, and only that, masquerading as the dead. There are others who believe that it's a combination, that that there is something of the personality that has been trapped of the dead person. It isn't absolutely clear what is true, because it's such a dark area. I'm inclined to believe that there are elements of the personality still present of the dead person, and quite why that dead person is chosen, because the very fact that these undead, to give it its most understandable term, issue forth from their nightly habitat and attack people sleeping quietly, and to all intents and purposes suck their blood and eventually destroy them. Not everyone, and by any means, in fact not most, who die of these pollutions will themselves become likewise afflicted. Though I know in the popular cinematic and literary culture that seems to be the fictional tradition. In truth, although those that are not, if it isn't interrupted, this feeding, these nightly visitations, if the appropriate repellents are not applied, and if nothing is done to stop these attentions to the victim, who will complain of suffocation and a total deficiency of spirits, they will eventually expire. But they themselves, if they have not, particularly according to Summers, if they've not led a life of more than ordinary immorality and unbridled wickedness, there is no reason why they should in any way become trapped. It is at that moment of death, which isn't true death, that I suppose the demonic agency can in some way affect the soul, so that although it's not any longer truly alive, it's not either truly dead. And appears to all of us as though it is a freshly deceased person. But if the agency is present, it will be put to an unholy purpose, and it is easy to believe in these cases that such malevolence sets into action forces which might prove powerful for terror and destruction, even when they are in their graves. And it is this that the two girls thought they witnessed, which led some, and my colleague Peter Underwood amongst them, to at first believe that there might be at Highgate a nest of vampires. What made that difficult was that after the, I suppose, television program, the very first one in 13th of March 1970.
The BBC?
No, that was Thames Television, which was an independent television company, but the main one, in fact, I think the only one at the time. The BBC one was later in the year. That really did set the imagination of would-be vampire hunters alight, and
I can imagine.
the place became besieged with any number of vampire seekers, some of them travelling considerable distances, and that continued for a little while. It included university students, all sorts, even rock stars, and I think
wow.
I think not too long after that, although he's now deceased, Lord, he stood at various elections, representing some mad raving loony party. But Lord David Such, not a real lord, of course, but David Such, who was a contemporaneous, of course. He was a rock singer, quite well known at the time. He tried to get in on the act, as did any number of people. And of course, the graveyard itself, although it had been used, I think, on a couple of occasions in the past for in the daytime, always in the daytime, for Hammer horror style films. And in fact, in the case of Taste the Blood of Dracula, it was actually used for the sets. But they, as you probably yourself remember, at that time they always shot night for day, or day for night.
Oh, yeah.
What was a nocturnal scene was obviously and quite apparently shot in the daytime.
Right.
And that tradition altered as film became faster, and they were able to, by the late 70s, shoot at night, as they did for the BBC film Count Dracula, which with Louis Jourdan, which again was shot in Highgate Cemetery, as well as Whitby and elsewhere, and they did shoot at night. But prior to that, certainly in the 60s and early 70s, they were shooting in the daytime as though it was night, and somewhat unconvincingly so. But it's an unhappy coincidence, really, that the place that they often used to as the evil heart of the cemetery was not too far away from the actual tomb of the vampire, as it was up until the turn of the early 70s.
Oh, yes.
Of course, by the time they were shooting the BBC film, it had long since been exorcised.
Right.
Reverend, I hate to interrupt you, but we're going to have to take a short break.
Certainly.
And when we come back with Reverend Sean Manchester, we'll discuss what happened in Highgate Cemetery. We'll be back after this.
See ya. And we're back to World of the Unexplained with Bishop Sean Manchester. Sean, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Great.
No.
Tell us. Okay, so at last we left. We were talking about we've got this hotbed of vampiric activity or what seems to be a hotbed of vampiric activity, and no one knows exactly how many of these creatures are there, and it's pretty much right there in Highgate Cemetery.
You have all these publicity seekers kind of getting in the way, more or less. I mean, how is it that...
Well, it's bound to happen that
certainly.
once something has a profile as high as that on television and in both national and international press, and almost straight away people are referring to it in their sort of ghost anthologies, it's bound to attract all sorts of people. I mean, from the more serious student who will be more respectful perhaps, to the people who in some ways understandably want to go on a sort of adventure, not entirely realizing the inherent danger in doing so. And it does, of course, like anything of this kind, whether it's UFOs or whatever, it does obviously attract its fair share of cranks.
Oh yeah,
and what have you. But that all died down. And on the positive side, I mean, there's no question or doubt, and the police were absolutely in agreement with this, that up until the turn of the 70s, up until it became public knowledge that something was going on in Highgate Cemetery, that the place was being used by, what can we call them, necromancers, left-hand path occultists, Satanists. The remnants of their ritual and activities was quite evident. In fact, it culminated in the summer of that year, 1970, when two schoolgirls, not the same two that I've already mentioned, came across the body of a decapitated corpse on the cemetery path whilst they were having an afternoon walk in the western half of Highgate Cemetery. And the police were in absolutely no doubt that this was the work of, to use their term, black magic devotees. And that had been going on for quite some time. I mean, decades rather than years. But that was rather horrific.
Certainly.
And there was other evidence that was not made public, which were quite clearly pointed it at black magic and necromancy and satanic ritual. The insides of some mausoleums, which of course most people don't venture to enter, betrayed all sorts of evidence which was unequivocal. But what happened after 1970 is that it became virtually impossible for these occultists with motives hidden in the darkness of the absurd to any longer use Highgate as their clandestine meeting place for nocturnal forays. And they obviously had to find somewhere else, and it's reasonably safe to say that the serious ones, the dangerous ones that certainly wouldn't want to advertise what they are doing, they couldn't any longer use that place for their ceremonies involving corpses, and that all came to an end. It was slightly eclipsed by one or two, I suppose, cranks or people who were drunk after the pubs had closed at night, going in there for what they thought was a bit of Halloween fun, and it getting out of hand due to the excess of alcohol. But I dare say that exists in lots of places anyway.
Oh, certainly.
The notoriety of Highgate might have sort of attracted one or two more than you would expect at the time. But that was a short-lived phenomenon, and it was a small price to pay to end Highgate Cemetery being a mecca for serious Satanists.
Right.
And as far as I'm aware, although of course there were, I mean, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There were definitely in the early 1970s. There were definitely vampire panics, and people were genuinely, and I believe justifiably, frightened and concerned. And some, a small minority, of course, took it upon themselves to become actively involved in the pursuit of whatever it was that was causing this disturbance. And I found it necessary to ask the public through television programs and the local press to allow the investigation to take its course and to let everyone just get on with their job rather than to have everyone at cross purposes meddling. And I think eventually that is what happened. I mean, there was an awful lot going on, and it was difficult at some points to know exactly what was what, because everyone was trying to get in on the act, and the media were the worst offenders in that respect. They just couldn't leave the place alone. And this is why I believe not only did those who are engaged in practical occultism quit the place, but I do believe they also took their undead, as it were, with them. But before they did, we had located it. And at first, it was located in the Terrace Catacomb, which is close to St. Michael's Church at the north end, the top end of the cemetery. And on the roof of the catacomb, at that time, I don't know if it's still there, I did mean to ask Friends of Highgate Cemetery about it. There, at either extreme end of the roof were two what would have been opaque circular windows. Now, one of these windows, I suspect it was to let in a bit of light for someone that was down there in the catacomb, and it would let a little bit of daylight in. A shaft of light would come down at one end, whilst another shaft would come out at the other extreme end. Now, one of these opaque windows, very thick glass, extremely thick, was still in place and affixed. The other one had clearly been broken and had long since gone, and the gravekeepers had covered up the hole, which was just about big enough for somebody to squeeze through. But then there'd be quite a drop underneath, and you'd have to be lowered on a rope. Okay. And it was in those catacombs that we made the discovery originally of a suspect coffin. And no sooner had we done this than that appeared to relocate very nearby, literally within a few feet, to a subterranean vault, which we located through someone else who'd been having visitations, not Elizabeth, somebody else, okay, who, in a trance state, led us to the vampire tomb. And this would have been in August 1970, and there is no question or doubt that, having looked at the names etched outside, that there was one too many coffins, and the one at the rear, which didn't really even resemble the others, it was virtually black, which is unusual in itself, and more of a casket, and completely superfluous to the list of names on the outside. That was the first encounter with what proved to be, indeed, the Highgate vampire. And it's only when we discovered in the putrid chamber of that tomb in August 1970 what we did, and looked upon the horrific countenance of what was inside, that we had absolute confirmation of what we were dealing with. And I had already gained permission at that point, and that's what we were doing there, from the London Cemetery Company, though at that point it was calling itself the United Cemetery Company. It was a private company which ran the cemetery, as most private companies do, on its own merit. And they said that it would be all right, a spoken exorcism at the mouth of the tomb would be fine. But when we made discovery of this extra casket, we were dealing with rather more than what we had bargained for. And it was quite terrifying, because we were thrown in, particularly was thrown in at the deep end, and we were confronting something with a few spoken Latin words that in the event would prove ineffective. I mean, I think we used 7 crucifixes, 4 white candles, 4 cups of holy water in the ceremony, carried out by 4 men and a woman, myself being one of the 4 men, on that August afternoon, to banish the spirits of evil, or the evil presence, using the Latin formula. And news of the spoken exorcism did indeed bring a sigh of relief to many living in the area. And a good many more considered this to be the final chapter of what had been a terrifying case of 20th century vampirism. Even some of my colleagues thought that this will be an end to it. But anyone believing that the Highgate vampire had passed into legend in that summer were in for a nasty shock. Those who breathed with relief would find such relief very short-lived, because strange occurrences failed to cease, and more horrifying incidents ended any hope that we'd quietened the disturbance with a mere spoken exorcism rite. Further vampiric outrages were to follow, and I think it's sometime after that. I mean, the cemetery officials did brick up that particular vault, and I don't know whether you have a copy, but in my book there is a photograph of the bricked up vault. It was bricked and cemented, and with a crucifix and holy water remaining inside. But whether or not that was before or after, it didn't remain bricked up for very long. Today it isn't bricked up at all, but of course today everything's quiet at Highgate Cemetery. What did happen was that particular casket was relocated elsewhere, and where it was relocated was not terribly far away. It was on the borders of Highgate, but it was a derelict neo-Gothic mansion, actually, in the subterranean bowel, the cellar of that place. And my own view is that the casket was taken there by these same occultists that perhaps would belong to a vampire cult, who were living emissaries to the same evil. And it was there that the final and most effective of all exorcisms that can take place occurred. Without going through all of the detail, we, upon its discovery, dragged the casket from the basement up the stairs into the grounds of the rear of the derelict building, at which time dawn was about to break, starting to send spears of bright illumination on to the macabre spectacle below. And one assistant had by this point quit, but I was left with Arthur, who rushed to fetch my accoutrements and returned with them. And eventually, when the lid was removed and we beheld the same thing that I had seen in August 1970, this was now the early part of 1974, something which had very much remained stained on my memory. Our quarry looked this time even more exaggerated, more distorted than I remember it. Far worse than even that time in the Highgate Vault. Burning, fierce eyes beneath furrowed brows, staring with almost hellish reflection, yellow at the edges with blood-red centers, unlike anything imaginable.
Wow.
The mouth set in a cruel expression, lips drawn back. It was as if the entire demonic form had not long ended its, if one can describe it as slumber, its slumber. It's difficult to talk in these material terms about something which defies, or appears to defy, human mortality, and it's said to cast no reflection or shadow. One has to be aware of things like antimatter, that's made up of atoms consisting of only antiparticles, unable to exist in the presence of normal matter. We're familiar with 3 dimensions, before, now, and after. These concepts of normal time, past, present, and future, don't exist in anti-time. This somewhat restricts us when trying to comprehend the world of the vampire, whose conscious energy, such as it is, exists outside of all ties of time. And the corporeal shell, which is occupied, is also transformed. It isn't merely a vehicle. It is, during that supernatural possession, transformed. It can manifest elsewhere and otherwise. It can become what it isn't. It has an unbelievable ability, which once the demonic agency has been removed, it ceases immediately to have. Their nether world is connected as a force to lend supernatural power, and the exorcism mysteriously reverses the process, and the being, that is to say the corporeal shell, returns to earthly time, some with a bang, when the evil contamination is expelled. Of course, the evil, supernatural evil, is removed. It isn't destroyed, but the supernatural condition is destroyed of the afflicted corpse, or what seems to be the afflicted corpse. But while in the supernatural condition, the atomic weight of the corporeal body seems to be raised above the rate of the Earth's vibration, which almost, quite incredibly, permits dematerialization and rematerialization, which is something which a lot of people have difficulty comprehending. But I don't understand why. Because scientists are of the opinion that's one of the only ways we can visit distant galaxies, is by a form of something very similar known as teleportation. But this certainly appears to be one of the bizarre supernatural abilities attributed to the vampire.
Right.
You know, when you exorcise these beings, you drive a stake through their heart.
Well, that is recommended. I mean, there is no question that cremation is the preferred method of anything of this kind.
I'm just wondering because it's you read so much folklore, and I have
Yes.
the summer stuff, and it talks about in some cases even the type of wood that should be used for the stake.
Yeah.
I've heard rosewood. I've heard what type of wood have you found to be effective? What things? I guess what I'm curious about is what works and what doesn't. Is garlic a repellent? Do these creatures actually not have a reflection in the mirror?
Do they fear running water?
Yeah, I mean, can they not cross running water?
The common vampire
I'm wondering
myths.
what's real and what's not. I guess.
One can only really talk about experience, and I would have questioned the running water thing until even in this case, a secondary contagion occurred north of Highgate at the Great Northern London Cemetery, where there did seem to be an apparent inability to cross running water. Pimm's Brook, which separated the boundary of the cemetery from what would have been Southgate, there were no incidents, yet everything on the cemetery side of that running water, the incidents crossed right over to Finchley. So if one can read anything into that, one would say that possibly there is something to the folklore of running water and the slack of the tide and yes, I think there might be something, but I can only speak from the experience I've had. Émilie Gérard, in her The Land Beyond the Forest, says that till the spirit has been exorcised by opening the grave of the suspected person and driving a stake through the corpse, it will continue. And she had studied the region where, of course, vampires were most prevalent at the turn of the 18th century. And Sir James Fraser, in his book The Fear of the Dead in Primitive Religions, further recommends to cut off the head and replace it in the coffin with the mouth filled with garlic,
Sewn shut.
or to extract the heart and burn it, strewing the ashes over the grave. Many, of course, believe that decapitation alone would not prevent the vampire's recovery, even though the folklore of many countries recount beheadings as a common practice to deter the undead. There is in an immediate situation, I think the impalation with a wooden stake is a very wise remedy in the first instance, but not the last act of exorcism to carry out. I mean, yes, in the case of the Highgate vampire, with a mighty blow, a sharpened shaft of wood impaled the creature's heart. As we witnessed the body shell cave in and quickly turn filthy brown, and that itself soon became a sluggish flow of inhuman slime and viscera in the bottom of the casket. But I think it was also important that the what remained, the casket included, was incinerated in flames. I think the impalation with a wooden stake through the heart, causing the organ which ingests blood to explode, thereby disrupting its function to invigorate the corporeal form, is perhaps the second most potent method of exorcism, next to cremation. Ideally, the wood should be of aspen or whitethorn, possibly blackthorn.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the whitethorn. I believe that wasn't that actually mentioned in Stoker's book Dracula, if I believe correctly.
It might have been based because Bram Stoker, of course, did a lot of research before writing that book, and his research was many of the books were non-fiction works on vampires.
Yeah, real mythology.
And I think it's safe to say that the preferred wood is due to the tree believed to have provided the wood for the crucifixion and the species used for the crown of thorns.
That would make sense.
Okay, I see the
It
connection.
is my view, however, that any wooden stake will be found to be efficacious. I think it's rather more important that the person using it has faith in what they are doing and why they're doing it, and is of the right mental, emotional and spiritual place in their life. I don't know what good it would do to have a non-believer, an atheist, driving or attempting to drive. Mind you, an atheist wouldn't be doing.
Yeah,
but I don't know. There are many arguments as to the presence of the cross, because obviously someone's belief in the symbol, some say the ultimate symbol of the triumph of good over evil, it is the belief that is all important. Yet a cross on its own, a crucifix on its own, will act as some form of deterrent. Holy things and Christian images are hateful to vampires, demons, evil spirits of all kinds. They loathe and detest and will shrink from such things. But that, coupled with the faith of a good and upright person, will be very hard for them to overcome.
So you certainly need a combination of things. It's not just simply the material, but you need to have the faith behind it to push it forward.
Do you think an iron or any kind of metal stake would suffice if someone had the sufficient faith?
Yes, I understand that is the culture, the tradition in some cultures. I just don't know, having not employed an iron stake myself. I wouldn't relate to it. Iron doesn't really relate to Christian iconography in the way that the wood does.
What did you use on the Highgate vampire? Did you go with the white thorn, or?
It was a wooden stake, and although there is a facsimile replica of it, the original obviously is now gone. In fact, burned. Because everything was consumed in the pyre, which where the flames spread quickly, and the coffin itself burst into flames, and everything was consumed, stake included. It was all hidden from our view in the smoke and the. I mean, it took quite a number of hours.
I can imagine.
All that remained was a great scorch mark and some bones that needed to be ground down and cast to the four corners or the four winds of the earth.
Wow.
But cremation is recommended as the ultimate deterrent and preventative to the vampire's nightly wanderings. It's not without its dangers. Creatures might attempt to leave the pyre, and though the corpse might be reduced to ashes, by no means will the bones all become dust. Everything has to be dealt with, and the dust of this particular pestilential evil was scattered, the bones ground, and everything was removed, so that there was no focal point. The present location, Highgate Cemetery, is purged, where the discovery was made of all these awful and terrifying things. And I and my colleagues and others are completely unaware of any other malevolent haunting or presence in that place. I have I'm on very good terms with the Friends of Highgate Cemetery, and they assure me that they too are unaware. Of course, they took over the cemetery in the year following the Highgate Vampire's exorcism, so there's no overlap there. They're embarrassed, of course, by people going on tours, because nobody for many years has been able to enter Highgate Cemetery freely and just wander about. Even the grave owners have to make appointments.
Okay.
But people can go on tours to the place, which are led by a guide and are closely monitored and supervised.
I hate to interrupt you again, Bishop, but it's time for our next break.
Okay.
We'll be right back with Reverend Sean Manchester
Here at World of the Unexplained.
And we're back here at World of the Unexplained with Bishop Sean Manchester. Bishop Manchester, tell us about what you're working on now. Are there any scourges of vampires there now that you know of, or are there any in America that you know
in the
UK
or Europe or anything?
Well, I do get reports. I have some excellent associates in the United States and in Canada and South America as well. But my remit, in all fairness, does not extend as an operative vampirologist or exorcist, does not extend beyond the British Isles. And although on some occasions it has included Europe, where we have taken an active interest and indeed conducted fieldwork, that is the exception rather than the rule. Although we do advise and give consultations and discuss the problems that people might be having in other parts of the world, there's not a lot we can do physically beyond that. We're pretty much tied up as it is in Great Britain, and the British Isles keeps. I mean, that my jurisdiction as a bishop does not extend outside the British Isles in any case, but even if it did, there would be other constraints. I mean, there's only so much anyone can do. But I don't look upon myself as some sort of latter-day Van Helsing. It is such a small strand of what I do, but it is nevertheless a strand. And it's one that can't be overlooked. And whilst it's true that my colleagues in the Eastern churches, Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Catholic churches, are willing to entertain, investigate, study, research, and on some occasions actually exorcise vampires. There's the famous Daniel Farson's film from the 1970s for the BBC, where he, I believe in a documentary, witnessed the exorcism, that it means the impalation of a vampire in Romania, I think it was, where an Eastern Orthodox priest officiated. I am aware that people on the Eastern wing of Christendom are, being perhaps more traditional and old-fashioned, are still willing to actively and without any fear of embarrassment, are still willing to engage in dealing with this problem. In the West, and it must be the same in America as it is here, certainly the Latin Church and the Anglican Church are embarrassed to admit to almost anything supernatural. I mean, it's as much as you can do to get a lot of them to accept that the miracles are real, that the resurrection actually, the physical, corporeal resurrection actually took place. And there are even ordained ministers that don't believe in God.
And it's a sad
and many
day.
more that don't believe in the devil.
But it's a sad day when churches, and especially churches that claim to be, Christ-led,
right,
won't even admit to their core values and core beliefs of what they claim to be in Paul.
It does present an enormous difficulty when people seek help, that they are confronted by a priest or whomever who doesn't even believe in the very least of the supernatural aspects of his own faith. Who will... I mean, we had a bishop not long ago, I think he's retired now, a quite famous Anglican bishop, who referred to the resurrection as a conjuring trick with bones, and believed that none of the miracles took place. Now, this was a bishop in the Anglican Church, in the Church of England, and unfortunately that trend has continued and grown. And that's why the traditionalist wing in all denominations, whether Anglican, Catholic, the traditional wing has become more consolidated and has a sort of strength in its small number, but because it's become a last bolt hole for the afflicted and the victims and those that are desperately looking for help. It's a last refuge where they can go. And the important thing is that there is somewhere where people can go if they feel they're being afflicted by the demonic. I mean, I find it quite amazing that that this matter should even be in question. I mean, the New Testament absolutely tells Christians, as well as priests and bishops, to put on the armor of God, so that they are able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. And I find it quite amazing that whilst some Christians are busily supporting wars and blessing guns and participating in them, perhaps, well, I don't really see how they can call themselves Christians in that sense, because we're taught that it's not against human enemies that we're to struggle, but against the principalities and the ruling forces who are the masters of the darkness in this world, the spirits of evil, the demonic presence in our world. Now, it's arguable that, yes, some of these bad people are being influenced, if not possessed, by demonic forces, but we should be dealing with the demonic force, not going to war, not invading people's countries, not obliterating mankind. We should be casting out darkness. And it does feel to me that the world has become a much darker place in my lifetime, a more dangerous place. And one of the contributing factors to that has been the ineffectiveness and unwillingness of church institutions. Now, I won't name any particular denomination because I think all the mainstream ones are guilty of watering down what is non-negotiable, and have becoming almost embarrassed and prudish and of what they should stand firm and abide by. And when asked, I do understand that in the case of exorcism you have to maintain confidentiality, and often a lot of it is done under the seal of the confession, which means it binds all parties not to reveal anything that takes place. But even without the seal, I do agree that where exorcisms are taking place, and there are obviously victims and victims' families, that needs to be kept out of the limelight, and that's why you seldom, if ever, hear about them. I mean, I did a program last year, I think it's for broadcast this year, on television, discussing exorcism, and of course the Exorcist was based on a very real case. Yes. But the real case was a boy, not a girl, and it was very near, only I think it was 10 miles away from where they set the film. But that was that had become public knowledge, unfortunately, for those concerned. And there isn't much one can do about it, rather like Highgate. There isn't very much one can do about it. I mean, the same thing happened at Kirklees, though I'm far from confident that we know what's happening at Kirklees, which has attracted much speculation and comment in the press, I think even in some radio and possibly even television programs. And that's a place in Yorkshire where people feared there might be a vampire contagion going back to the Middle Ages. I investigated it eventually in April 1990, but we were looking into it from as early as 1988, and there were concerns that bodies on unconsecrated ground close to a priory ruin might be responsible. I'm less sure of that now. This might have been due to finger-width holes being observed in the earth above the tomb in the winter of 1987, animals drained of blood being discovered in the immediate vicinity, people being obliged to call in priests to exorcise their homes of malignant forces. These incidents go back to the early 60s, where somebody taking an autumnal stroll with a friend confronted what appeared to be a female spirit or apparition gliding towards him and his friend, with no sound of feet walking over the dry leaves and twigs. Now, that's very similar to what we confronted in Highgate. A lot of people describe this quite tall spectre, dark though, a dark spectre. They often described it as floating, and suddenly it could move very, very quickly. It was floating slowly. Then all before you knew it, it was really close. That had some of the hallmarks of that occurred at Kirklees, but and indeed, when we were there, one of my colleagues thought he'd encountered a hideous hag spectre, again a female with burning red eyes. I'm still not convinced that what we're dealing with up there, and it is on private ground, so the land is part of Kirklees Park Hall Estate, which is in the ownership of landed gentry. So one has to be very careful. We don't want to be inviting people onto private land. I'm not sure that we are anywhere closer now to knowing what we were dealing with back then, and I'm far from convinced that that is a vampiric occurrence, though I wouldn't rule it out.
Let me ask you a question, Bishop. Have you, since your involvement in Highgate and some of these other vampire investigations, have you been targeted? Have you been hunted? Do you feel...
That's a good question.
Do you feel this demonic pressure around you at times where you look around and say, uh-oh, they're coming after me. It's time to go to war again, time to fight this evil?
Well, I think if there's a priest alive who doesn't, to some extent, feel that, he's an ineffective one. Because if you're not up to much in the, I suppose, the battle that matters, the battle against this demonic legion, if you're not having any effective, if what you're doing is not causing any disturbance amongst the dark forces, you'll almost certainly be left alone. But obviously, anybody, any priest, I would hope, but certainly anybody that's engaged in a ministry of deliverance, healing, exorcism, I would like to think that they did put on the full armor of God and protect themselves. And you might well imagine that I am well and truly protected in the spiritual sense.
Oh, yes.
And don't really walk this earth fearfully in that regard, but I am not contemptuous of the ability of these dark forces and the wiles of the devil, and I don't underestimate anything or anybody, but I take one day at a time and certainly one night at a time and enjoy them and do what I feel is right based on the revealed truth and act accordingly. And if I was at all worried about what might happen to me as a consequence, I would never have been chosen for this sort of work in the first place, and would not have been able to sustain 4 decades of its execution. On the other hand, I have been targeted by, of course, and I've made this point before, I would imagine any number of occultists, particularly left-hand path occultists, who must, have obviously, like anybody in the public eye, I've received the usual unkind words and threats and curses, but I might have had the more formal curse done against me. And all I can say is that I'm now no longer a young person, but nothing untoward has happened. And I think that's largely because the set of symbols they work with and their psychology is one of the victim having to know about it, having no armor to protect themselves with, and fearing. Their main weapon, apart from blood and death, is fear. And I'm afraid, because I don't have that fear of their pins in dolls or whatever it is they happen to do, their incantations, evocations, and whatever invocation they choose, it has precious little effect. I mean, I wouldn't have lasted this long if it worked independently as an external reality.
You know, one of our upcoming guests, I'd been talking to, had said, he had been the target of a lot of these demonic attacks that Satanists and other groups had put on him.
Yeah.
And he said that, I'm protected, I'm covered by the blood of Christ. I'm covered, I'm protected by, I think he said it was a Latin word or another word, dome, and he kind of made the analogy, it is like a dome. He says, the dome, the blood covers me, and it bounces back to them, and it harms them more than it actually, affects me.
Yes, I would just like to add a codicil. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you've just said, 100%. And of course, such people who I suppose are disciples of the devil, such people know this. And whether they bother to, I think some of the more disturbed and unbalanced ones might actually waste their time in trying to carry out futile curses and hexes and rituals. But I think, and it's true for others, that what they try to do is attack the vulnerable who might be close or near you. So they will seek out people who are construed, at least, to be much more vulnerable, who might not have the same degree of protection in their eyes, and they would go for a softer target. And that has been my experience. That's precisely. There's hardly been a member of my family, friends, colleagues, assistants, associates who are known or who can be known through public records and doing a little bit of research. It doesn't take very much. Who haven't had some sort of unwelcome contact of this sort.
Oh, certainly.
But it has been withstood, and I'm happy to say that nobody's the worse. And it would be somebody who is very vulnerable, who is susceptible, perhaps a little bit disturbed themselves, who would be the easiest to get to. But somebody who is none of those things would be very difficult. I mean, my experience of people in the occult is that many of them don't actually believe in what they're doing. In fact, many of them claim they don't. They see it as a sort of psychological exercise. They don't actually believe that these things exist, and they do them as mental exercises. Ultimately, in covens and cults and groups of this kind, it's all to do with control, manipulation, control over other people, and using fear as a manipulative tool. And the majority of, certainly the leaders, don't appear, they appear to be closer to atheism than anything else. And they're using psychological terror and more like psychological war games. But you do get the odd one who does believe it, and many of the rank and file believe it, particularly the ones that are vulnerable. Maybe they're on drugs. Many of them are, of course. Maybe they have a weakness for alcohol. Maybe they have a mental disability. These people, of course, very often do believe. But either way, whether those in on the left-hand path, whether they believe in something or don't believe in it and simply use it as a means to an end, that doesn't alter the reality of whether it does exist or not.
Yeah, they're certainly playing a very dangerous game for certain. Bishop Manchester, if I may ask this question, I'm a little curious. With the Highgate vampire and its minions, and including all the years after that, how many of these sorts of creatures have you been personally involved in their destruction?
Well, it is genuinely difficult to quantify these things, because in many cases where you and even where you succeed in expelling a demonic interference, you are less certain of what it is exactly. I mean, a vampire is a word, it's not a terribly old word at that, to describe a particular predatory entity that has existed, well, since the fall.
Right.
And different civilizations and cultures have given it different names. Vampire being a recent Eastern European origin one, of Slavic origin. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about the same phenomenon, but we're actually talking about the demonic legion, of which the vampire is particularly pernicious because of its predatory nature and its apparent lust for blood. And it is difficult to quantify. After I'm in the fourth decade of dealing with this area as an operative demonologist or exorcist, and I would say the number is, even of the predatory kind, is in the dozens. More rather than the single numbers, because one has learned to err on the side of caution and extirpate quickly what is considered to be contaminated, and there is no better form than the incineration of fire. And it is not wise to scientifically examine and dissect something which is a product of demonic contagion. It is important to deal with it swiftly and with a strong heart and mind. But I mean, of course, exorcism doesn't kill the agent. It casts it out of our sphere or dimension. But what's left behind is removed. Once cremated, quickly returns to its true state, which will be ashes, dust.
Yes.
And thereby we're no longer plagued by the apparent supernatural ability it once had to manifest, as though it was living. But of course it wasn't. It was the devil's undead, not one of God's true dead.
Oh, certainly.
Do you believe that a living human being could become possessed by this agent, or become this agent for this creature for a limited time, and then if the proper exorcism was achieved, that person could be normal again?
Yes, I do believe that any form of demonic disturbance, interference, contamination can affect any human who becomes open to it. is not protected properly.
Yeah.
If they could just simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. More often than not, it's because they dabble. It's because they take themselves to the wrong place, and very often they open doors best left shut. They invite in what should never cross their threshold.
Now, Bishop, I have another question. I'm sorry to cut you
Yes,
off there,
that's fine.
but you know, I've made this argument with several people. You know, everyone that listens to our show knows that I have no qualms at all about telling them I'm a Christian and, you know, all
Yes.
that. And a lot of people give me, you know, bad email for it, but that's okay. They can
Let them.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have to listen. So, but, you know, the thing is, you know, me and Trent had this conversation before too, and we say, well, you know, if Christ is inside you, if you're a true believer in Christ, then how could one become
Possessed
demonically or diabolically afflicted? And I don't know. I guess that's the only thing that we can come up with is that that door is, you know, you have to let that in, and you have to
Yes.
be, you know,
It has to be
give
by
it permission.
But bear
by
in
invitation.
mind, I absolutely agree. If Christ is within you and you walk with God and you are washed in the blood of Christ and you are saved, you are the most difficult person to be afflicted by demonic interference. However, we are all human, and we all are flawed. Peter denied Christ three times.
Yeah.
Who was the favorite? We all have moments of weakness. There's not one amongst us who hasn't made a mistake, who hasn't done wrong. And it is in that moment that we must be guarded. Who knows where. But I do agree that if we walk with Christ, we are the least likely of victims and the most likely of Samaritans to help those that are afflicted and sadly are not walking with Christ.
Well, you know, I was just gonna go on a bit more and say, you know, that I've made the comment openly many times on the show that it seems like, you know, there's so many people out there that openly claim to be Christian, but when you examine, like we were talking earlier about the priest, you know, you examine their belief system and then you find out, well, they don't even believe in Christ. They believe him as some kind of metaphor,
or the devil for that matter.
Yeah, they don't even believe in true evil. They believe it's
like,
they believe in good and bad, and
or
good
good.
will triumph over evil. It's
It's like they say, Scott, the greatest trick the devil ever played on man was convince the world he didn't exist.
Yeah.
Yes,
So-
yes, absolutely.
It's just it's a day. I think it's a day that's you know, you're seeing some of those fulfillments that Revelation talks about. You know, the
I
Antichrist.
absolutely agree. It's very hard not to acknowledge that we are in what some might describe as end times. That so much is happening so fast. I have witnessed such change in my lifetime that it's hard to deny the reality that is in front of us is happening right in front of our eyes. But the devil is seldom seen by Satanists as more powerful than God, albeit they see him as more immediate than God. But my concern is that, I mean, take the Sunday Times 9 years ago, on the 30th of November. The Sunday Times, a very respectable British newspaper, reported that 70 Church of England ministers, priests that is, stated that they did not believe in God. What on earth are they doing?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, being priests, why don't they take up social work, or why don't they become counselors,
exactly.
or do something else? They're denying that position to somebody who might actually believe in God.
Yeah, certainly.
Now, that was 9 years ago. I fear that number might have increased. The liberalisation and modernization of all the mainstream churches, and I'm very ecumenical in as much as if somebody is saved, they're saved. If somebody believes in Christ, they are a follower. If somebody is true and acknowledges Christ as their Savior, they're already Christians. They don't have to sign on any dotted line. It helps, obviously, to be participating and to be in a congregation, a community, a communion, and to belong, and but where two or more Christians are together, that's where his church is. And a church isn't a marvelous building with ornate statues. A church is where just two or more Christians are gathered together in his name. And my fear is that those that are gathering, I can only speak from my country, in churches here are less than what one might expect. Take my own Episcopal Diocese of Glastonbury, where they appointed some years ago, not long ago, just a handful of years ago, a priestess as the head of the Church of England in the High Street. A priestess who has lots of pagan connections. Yeah. And that church has an ecumenical multi-faith tradition where they allow witches and to participate, to dance in the aisles. They used to have a large screen at the front where the altar should be, where they put up sort of dance music. And people of various beliefs, philosophies and religions, I suppose Buddhists and all sorts, were participating in these multi-faith regular, I think they were weekly, but they were regular and still are, I suspect, get-togethers. But one of the component parts I noticed was the presence of witches cavorting about in the aisles and dancing around. Now, to me, that isn't how the church should be conducting itself. And I'm obviously seen as an old traditionalist by them, but I cannot regard them as being truly Christian. In the nearby repository, which is an annex of the ruined Glastonbury Abbey, they have for many years, along with Christian books, also sold books which are clearly pagan, and it seems inappropriate in a repository to include that.
I agree, but Bishop, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you again, but we're going to have to take our last break.
Yeah, break number 3.
And I want to remind all of our listeners that this is a pre-recorded show, so you can call the 800 number tonight, but we'll just laugh at you. No, I'm kidding. You can call the 800 number tonight, but we won't answer it. But we will be in the chat room talking about this. So
we'll be back in just a little bit with the Bishop Sean Manchester.
And we're back with Bishop Sean Manchester here on World of the Unexplained. Sean, are you still with us?
I am indeed.
Great.
Fantastic. Going back to the current sphere of things as far as vampiric and other dark occult activities are going. Basically, my question is, Bishop, where does it seem from your research and from people who send you information, where does it seem that the hot spots of occult or even vampiric activity seem to be taking place? If there's any way you can distinctly pinpoint geographically.
Geographically, mm-hmm. Certainly in the major cities. But it's difficult. But there's also been some really horrific cases in small villages in Italy, in other parts of Europe. I don't know if there is any particular hotspot any longer. There might have been in the past. I don't know. I think that the state of the world today would allow for evil to manifest almost anywhere, and it seems as if the globalization of the world has, in some way, left us open. Everything's so immediate. Everything is so connected that it leaves less time to find and provide sanctuary.
Oh, okay. So, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Certainly.
Well, with that being said, Scott and I had a discussion about this a number of weeks ago, and it's sort of a continuing discussion, and basically it comes down to the fact of, in the nature of vampirism and the restless dead, or whatever you want to call them, it seems that figures are sort of divided into two camps, and that's to say, on one side you have the vampire in sort of a romantic myth, Dracula-style, suave, charming individual who's a predatory monster, and the other camp is basically just a predatory monster that lacks any sort of human elements whatsoever. In your discussion, which side do you seem to fall on in your experience? I mean, have you ever encountered elements from both sides, or just the predatory monster kind?
Well, I certainly haven't ever encountered anything resembling what can be described as a Byronic figure from a Gothic romance. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was born amid the sombre avenues and forest trees of Sherwood, very close to Newstead Abbey. That tradition in fiction, which has greatly affected cinematic and literary, I suppose, vampire archetypes, has a lot of Byronic input, largely due to John William Polidori's novel *The Vampire*, yes. Which, of course, Lord Ruthven being Lord Byron. Uh-huh. And no, the eyeless sockets of impenetrable darkness that I've encountered bear no resemblance to that rather glamorized image that you, even in Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, was romanticized to the point where one was expected to have sympathy and feeling for this biocidal contamination that kills everything in its sight. There are no redeeming features. These are demonic, and how they fascinate is on a level which is difficult to understand if you have not been fascinated by them. Their enchantment is grotesque to the eye of the observer, but not to the eye of the victim. I mean, they are, to all intents and purposes, a decomposing, putrid, walking corpse. Mm-hmm. At least that's what they might appear to be. And yet, they can seemingly seduce and fascinate and entrance their victims. That's because something else is working on another level. And why don't they manifest as something more attractive? Why are all the accounts, whether it's the Highgate Vampire or any other... I mean, I have been on a case recently which has now come to fruition, which I can't discuss, but because it has slightly over the last... how many? Where are we? Certainly decade and a half. Because it has been mentioned elsewhere, I can say the Abney Park vampire. I have been on that case for some time, and I have been dealing with it in the field, operatively. Why do they always manifest as something so ugly? And that's because evil is ugly. The devil is grotesque. And Satan is a deceiver and wants to deceive us into accepting ugliness and unattractive and unbelievably vile things. If it was always beauty to look upon, we wouldn't be taken far enough. I mean, in my lifetime, I have been amazed at how people on a day-to-day basis absorb and digest a diet of pure violence, pornography, depravity, decadence, degeneracy, when what they look at on the television, the films they go to watch, the things they read, the magazines they choose. It is beyond belief that this steady diet, hour after hour, the newspapers they read, it's death, carnage, murder, awful court cases. The news is full of ugly images of dead bodies, mutilated bodies, war zones, films full of depravity and pornography of the most extreme kind imaginable that people now find themselves being entertained by. There is this drip effect of something very ugly happening. I don't know when it began. Certainly started way back in probably the 70s, probably the early 70s. I don't know. But I do know it's getting worse, and it's growing, and it's all consuming. Whereas a small number of people engaged in the culture of death, violence, and depraved sex, now it seems the norm. Well, at least here it does. I don't know how bad things are where you are.
Oh,
here in the UK, it's become the norm. I mean, visitors come from America, and quite frankly, when they switch on our television set, they can't believe what they're watching. And guests come on shows, and they can't believe how they're being spoken to, with obscene language and foul language being used openly on fairly early in the evening by their standards. And they can't understand it, because it would never be allowed unless it was cable. It would never be allowed on normal terrestrial television. And yet it's become the norm here. And I think that has a very deleterious effect on everybody. I mean, I try to watch as little as I can. And I'm very selective. I watch nature programs and religious and spiritual programs, but there's very few of those, and you end up watching them over and over again. I find it's difficult to use the internet without being bombarded with depraved rubbish. You never know what you're reading or whether it's genuine. You never know whether the person you're hearing from is the person they claim to be. It's a world of illusion and delusion. It's a world of deceit and it's the world of the devil, really. And we've become, as I say in my work, From Satan to Christ, this is the age of Satan. I think the Satanists themselves describe it as all sorts of things, the age of Horus, all sorts. But it is the age of Satan. And if the 20th century, as some historians are claiming, was the most violent of all the centuries we've ever had, the most war-torn and the worst century for human destruction, self-destruction, the 21st century is looking like its spiritual and occult counterpart. And I think that things are starting to take shape in a way that those that are familiar with the last book of the Bible will easily recognize.
Well, and I guess that sort of cultural and social elements certainly favor demonic forces and the devil himself. You know, you get people exposed to these things, and they become more accustomed to them, and in some ways, and for some people, it becomes very attractive, when in fact they don't realize the bigger picture of it being the brutal reality that it is. And certainly very, very bad things. Let's see.
But more and more people have over the years turned to the dark occult, to all manifestations of it. I mean, I've been on programs discussing one that comes to mind, comparative religion, and in the audience were people, some describe themselves as witches, others as forms of pagan like druids, but others were quite overtly self-proclaimed Satanists. And why would they want to describe themselves as such? Why would they want to be participating in something which is clearly the celebration of evil? But they do, and that has been on the increase for some time. And the glorification and celebration of evil, I think, seeps into our entertainment media. I mean, most films and most entertainment we seem to be bombarded by is not giving us wonderful stories. It's not Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, is it? It's the dreadful tales of man's inhumanity to man, and 1,000 ways to murder your neighbour and violate people around you, and the quickest way to destroy, maim, and injure. And this is the diet that people have chosen. It's fast food and it's no good for you spiritually.
No, absolutely not. And this is another issue. Going back to vampires, disproving the sort of romantic myth of what they are. Now let's talk about their effect around the people that are attracted by them. Like you said before, these cults of the vampire, these sort of dark occult things. Do you believe they have in their own way some sort of influence on the social world? For example, a vampire that attracts somebody to it who happens to be, I don't know, on the board of some major television corporation. Do you see where I'm going with this? That the vampire powers are...
I don't know if I'd use... I think there is definitely dark forces. I mean, even our Queen, Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, said herself that it was reported a year or two back, there are dark forces at work about which we know very little. And she's right, there are. The judge, I think his name was Jerry Lockett, who sentenced Rod Ferrell to die in the electric chair. I don't know whether that's been reduced to life sentence or not, but he was a vampiroid, someone that celebrated the archetype, the vampire archetype, and himself. You might remember the case. Judge Jerry Lockett said there is genuine evil in the world. There's a dark side and a light side competing in each of us. And he said to Ferrell, there's little doubt on which side you went. And this phenomenon, vampiroidism, which is a cult which is barely a couple of decades old, which is a worldwide phenomenon, where vampire cults and societies gather not just, we were always aware of groups that gathered to celebrate the literary and cinematic presentation of the fictional vampire, but these are people who gather rather like extremist political groupings or religious sects or secret societies perhaps, with a degree of awareness and fanaticism to drink blood and to even murder, as in the case of Rod Ferrell. Who with his, he convinced several teenagers, including Heather, was she his girlfriend, to drink blood and join his cult, promising them that they'd live forever. And of course, 10 years ago, November the 26th, after hours of what is described in the court record as devil worshipping and drinking each other's blood, 5 members of the cult, including Rod Ferrell, of course, drove to Heather's parents' house in Florida and bludgeoned her parents to death. And detectives raiding the bedroom of Heather found drawings of demons and a video of interview with a vampire, and handwritten letters revealing how she loved to drink blood before sex.
Wow. In
one, she described Rod Ferrell as her saviour. Well, this, unfortunately, is all too common. It's all part of the conflict between Satan and Christ, as I see it. And it invariably subscribes to an approaching final conflict. As everlasting life awaits those who are saved, it seems that this longing for eternity is imitated and parodied by Satan. Thus, the vampire, who knows, perhaps even the vampire cultists, fits the description of the Antichrist as described in Thessalonians. And the vampire, the real vampire, the supernatural predatory entity, is nothing short of a manifestation of a vile blasphemy, parodying and perverting the redeeming blood to its own foul contamination of living death. A walking corpse counterfeit version of the Christian resurrection.
Yes, certainly.
But all that is satanic, and sadly satanic cults are on the rise as never before in our world, from Russia to America to Europe to Asia. All that is satanic is fraudulent and a depraved imitation of Christ's gifts and promises. The cult of the vampire turns all that is redemptive upside down and offers this diabolical belief system as an alternative to salvation, whilst in truth it's a recipe for damnation. The vampire is masquerading, in other words, to trick us, to seduce us, to bring us into its world, where we will thence fall prey.
That's quite a terrible situation indeed.
Definitely.
I guess
and therefore the onus is on us, you, me, and your colleague. The onus is on us to take up our cross, follow him, but to do something, not to be inactive, not to pass by, but to become the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, and to be active, to operational, to actually not just think, but to actually take it up and do something. We all believe, perhaps, in the idea of good triumphing over evil. It's quite something else to participate in the reality of good triumphing over evil. And we can only do that by becoming disciples of Christ.
Certainly.
Well, Bishop, I'm afraid our time's at an end here. We're going to have to wrap this up. But do you have any final parting words or anything like that you would like to mention?
Well, St. Paul, as I have no need to tell you, reminds us that the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. I personally fear that time has now arrived. And few will disagree that in recent years the world has become a far less safe place. Yet even in the growing darkness, new disciples are taking up their cross to follow Christ. The glorious moment when it arrives will find his true followers ready. The nature of man without Christ is obviously spiritually weak and highly susceptible to infestation by demons. There is little he can do about fighting off demons if Christ is not dwelling within.
Very well put.
Thank you, Bishop, and we're very, very happy to have you come on the show, and we know your schedule's very busy, and we appreciate you taking the time out.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure and an extremely interesting 2 hours.
Well, might I also say that I am extremely delighted to have spoken to you, and it has been a most pleasant experience and one that I shall remember with fondness.
Thank you.
I wish both of you peace and blessings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bishop Manchester.
Farewell.
Goodbye.